Hello, friends. Have you ever received a message from an unexpected source? Well, Paul did, and it changed his life. So today we want to look at our second series in Galatians, and it's going to be on Galatians, the first chapter, verses 11 through 24. So last we spoke on the first sermon on the first 10 verses. So let's look into the next one here. Last time Paul warned against false teachers and false gospels, and then this sermon Paul warns, or Paul defends the divine origins of his message. Paul says here, he explains here how that his message did not come from man, but from God. Now, notice closely here the way Paul words his next statements. Paul says, "But I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is neither after man, it is not after man, for I neither received it of men, neither was I taught it, but by revelation of Jesus Christ." Okay, so what Paul's saying here is, Paul is trying to get at the idea that his gospel, he was not commissioned by the church in Jerusalem. Now, what it took place is, as we spoke before, a group of Jewish believers had circulated through the area of Galatia, and they were saying that Paul was not an original apostle, as we spoke before. He wasn't an apostle, one of the 12. He was sent out by the church in Jerusalem. He was sent out by the apostles, and now he's presumptuously speaking of his own message, and a message that he's made up. And Paul, the problem is, or the reason why Paul is speaking in such a manner, is because Paul doesn't have a proper understanding of the gospel, and basically he should have stayed underneath the tutelage of the rest of the other apostles and not ventured out on his own. So, and that Paul has messed people up with his understanding. That was the idea. Now, Paul has a starkly different perception of his message in relation to the other church. In the church, not that there wasn't a conflict between Paul and the apostles, but indeed there was some who came from the Jerusalem church who claimed that there was some kind of conflict, and then they're trying to highlight on that conflict. So notice now Paul acknowledges that he preaches a different gospel than anyone else. He preaches a different gospel than the apostles. He preaches a different gospel than the elders in Jerusalem. He preaches a different gospel than what is preached everywhere. And Paul knows that the whole thing comes from, he's the first one to speak it. So this is why he's speaking in the language that, and using the language that he used. And notice he says, "But I certify you." It means I bring you before an official statement. Okay, he said, "I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me." See, now notice here he says, "The gospel which was preached of me." He is acknowledging that he preaches a different gospel than what others preach. And Paul believes that his gospel is a deeper revelation than what others are preaching, a further revelation. He says, "The gospel which was preached of me is not after man." See, so now notice he's saying this there, no one taught it to him. He did not learn it from anyone. No one taught it to him. The apostles in Jerusalem did not teach it to him. No one in Arabia taught it to him. No one in Tarsus taught it to him. Barnabas didn't give it to him. No one gave it to him. Now, that is a pretty strong statement, because notice here, who else could say this, that they received, that they have a message that they did not receive from someone else? Who else can say that? Because if you go into the Cornelius, he received it from Peter. The Ethiopian, he received it from Philip. You see? But Paul is saying that the message that he received, he did not receive it from any person. No man gave it unto him. Now, Paul's hearkening back now, and further on, he will hearken back to the calling he received on the road to Damascus. He says, "For I neither received it of man." See? No one come along and told me the gospel that I'm preaching, it's different. And we'll get into that, the minutia of that, in the later sermons in this series. But Paul is acknowledging, and that's what we want to set up here in this sermon, that Paul is acknowledging that his doctrine is different. It is not like any other person's. It's not like any other man. And so then he's acknowledging that it is different. And so then, because it's different, that now he's running into conflict with others. Okay, but why? Why does he have this conflict? You see, Paul's going to, in later chapters, explain, but first off, he's acknowledging. So he says, "Neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ." It came to me by revelation. Jesus Christ gave me a personal revelation. Now, that is a bold statement. He is saying that what I received, look, I know that Peter, James, John, Bartholomew, Thaddeus, all of them, Nathaniel, Judas, not Issachar, all of them, they met Christ. And Christ gave to them a message. But he come around and gave me a further message that he did not give to any of them. And he gave it to me personally. That is a bold statement. You see? And so then we're going to see this recurring pattern throughout Paul's ministry and throughout his letters of Paul making this same claim repeatedly, and why he feels the need to defend it, because he's preaching, the gospel that he's preaching is not the same gospel that others are preaching, but Paul believes that the gospel that others are preaching is a true gospel, but the one that I'm preaching is a further revelation of the gospel that they're preaching. So let's go on here. He says, look at this here. "For ye have heard of my conversion in times past in the Jewish religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it." So now, see, again, now he's hearkening back to his experience on the road to Damascus. And what he's doing here is he's drawing a parallel. Look, no one gave it to me. You see, it wasn't when I was arresting Christians in Jerusalem and throwing them in prison. It wasn't like any one of them stopped me along the way and gave me a message and converted me. I was still persecuting the church. None of them had convinced me. You see, no one had convinced me. I was deliberate in my actions. No one come along and dissuaded me from my course of action. I persecuted the church of God beyond measure. See, because he had just now made the statement, if you'll notice, that it was Christ who revealed this to me. So this is why the very next statement is, he says that I wasted it beyond measure. And he goes even further. I profited in the Jewish religion above many mine equals. You see? And there's such a plethora of statements in there, okay? And many in mine equals. In mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. Now, a little bit of history here. Paul, the Sanhedrin had chosen Paul to lead this persecution. Paul was taking bands of soldiers, or we'll say not Roman soldiers, but soldiers of the synagogue. And he was taking them into every house. And we learned that it was because of this persecution that many people were fleeing out of Jerusalem because of Paul's persecution that he led. And he was going them into house, dragging them out and throwing them in prison. Now, one can imagine that the end of a lot of these prison sentences was death. And Paul knew he was doing it, but he thought he was doing God's will. And he goes even further and says, I profited in the Jewish religion above many of mine equals in mine own nation. Paul studied under Gamaliel for 12 years, would have been the standard education. So he probably went down from Tarsus. He went down to Jerusalem and studied for 12 years at about the age of 14. So at about the age of 26, his education would have been done. And then Paul was in Jerusalem around, we'll say AD, that would have been anywhere between AD 28 to AD 30 that Paul finished his education under Gamaliel. So he's in Jerusalem. And after the persecution of Stephen, which was about a year after the ascension of our Lord, so about AD 34, here he is still in Jerusalem. So now 8 years have passed since he's finished his education. One would imagine that he's probably been in Jerusalem all this time. It's a possibility that after his education was finished, he went back to Tarsus, but most likely not. Anyway, he's in Jerusalem. Now, the Sanhedrin decides that they are going to lead stomp out this new sect. And of all the people that are part of the Sanhedrin, they chose Paul to lead it. Now, that's telling there. They could have chose any other person in Jerusalem. And then what is even more telling, okay, is the fact that one of Paul's contemporaries, who was educated in the same seat next to Paul, all the years that Paul was educated under Gamaliel, was a man by the name of Simon ben Gamaliel I. Ironically, this was Gamaliel's son. So Paul was a pupil with Gamaliel's son. And Gamaliel was the most revered man in Jerusalem and all Israel at the time. He was given the nickname as the light of the law. He was the president of the Sanhedrin. And being so revered, one would have immediately imagined that Gamaliel, having such sway in the Sanhedrin, would immediately have chosen his son. But contrary to the Greeks and the Romans that lent credibility because of someone's lineage, the Jews lent credibility because of someone's tutelage, meaning that they wanted to know who your teacher was and your teacher's teacher, you see, and not necessarily who your father is, but who is your teacher. Simon ben Gamaliel later, almost 30 years later, ended up becoming president of the Sanhedrin. There was another man in between his father and him. So they thought that he was worthy enough to become president later in the 60s AD. But when compared to Paul, they chose Paul over this man. Even Gamaliel chose Paul over his own son. And look what Paul said. He said, and I profited in the Jewish religion above many mine equals. In mine own nation, Why? Because I was more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers than all of them. That's why I excelled. They thought, and then you could imagine Paul had a mind that was unmatched. And Paul's zeal for and when he says the tradition, well, that's obviously the law. He had a mind that was unmatched in the law. Well, he shows that in his later writings. The dialectic education that he received under Gamaliel is not to be compared with. So then, here is Paul is saying they chose me. And then once they chose me, I was going to do my job and no one was going to dissuade me. No man. I was persecuting them unto death, he says in a later letter. And no one was going to dissuade me. I wasted the church, he said. You see? So then, far be it that I'm going to come up underneath men and be persuaded by them. I wouldn't be persuaded by anybody. I was wasting the church. So obviously it wasn't somebody in Jerusalem or a church or a council who came and gave me my revelation. You see? So that's why that's what Paul's saying here. So let's go on to the next. He says, but when it pleased God. See, why didn't God call me when he called the rest of the apostles? Would be the natural question. I mean, look, let's be honest. Let's just do some simple math here. If Paul was born about 84, right around there, 82 to 84, then, and Paul was in Jerusalem. His education was finished around 28. Then he was in Jerusalem when Jesus started his ministry. He was older than John and younger than Peter. Why didn't he call me then? Let me be one of his disciples then, an apostle then. You see? But Paul had already resolved this question in his mind. Remember we said last service that his time in Arabia that he had an existential identity crisis. Oftentimes, if a person is going through this type of crisis, that these are the questions they would have asked, and they've also settled them if they were able to come through them, which obviously Paul in later life shows that he was able to come through at his time in Damascus. So then, he says, but when it pleased God, who also separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, when it pleased him to reveal his son in me. See, it was on that road to Damascus. He came and called me, just like he called Peter and John on the shores of Galilee, just like he called Nathanael from underneath the tree when he was praying. When I was walking on the road to Damascus, he called me. See, Paul did not see his calling any different than the rest of them. To reveal his son in me, that why did he do it? He didn't do it that, you see, now here's Paul's getting into the crux of his message, that I might preach him among the heathens. See, there's the difference. There's the difference. Peter and John and them are called to preach him among the Jews. They're called to preach him to the house of Israel, but I'm not. And so I received a gospel that was in an elevated manner. Now he says, when God did this, I immediately did not confer with flesh and blood. I didn't go ask people to tell me about this, straighten me out. He says, neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me. See, I did not run to Peter and say, Peter, I realize that Jesus is the Christ. Teach me your ways. He didn't do this. Why is Paul saying this? You see, Paul feels the need to defend his calling and his message, but first he's defending his calling before he defends his message because of what they're saying about him. You see, what they've been saying about him. He said, but I went into Arabia. Now we know he went into Arabia for 3 years. And during this period, Paul had that identity crisis and he was searching out his own salvation through fear and trembling. He realized how wrong he had actually been. And his whole world was turned upside down in a moment's time. When Paul was on the road to Damascus, and he heard a voice, and he saw that great pillar of fire, and it was the same pillar of fire that had met Moses. Paul, being zealous of the tradition of the laws more than any other person in Jerusalem, would have known that that is Yahweh. And he wouldn't have responded to any other. That is the great God, the Shema. Hear you, O Israel, I the Lord God am one. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Paul knew he was staring at the same God Moses stared at. And in the great pillar of fire, the Logos. And Paul says, Lord, capital L-O-R-D, Lord, who are you? He said, Paul, it's hard for you to kick against the thorns, isn't it? And Paul said, Lord, who are you? Evidently. I mean, think about this for a second. Talking about an existential crisis, an identity crisis. He said, Paul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting me? Paul, up until that very moment, he thought he was God's closest companion. He thought he was the greatest warrior in the world for God, for the great Lord. And in just a few sentences, he realizes that he is not his greatest defender, he's his greatest persecutor. And he said, Paul, it's hard for you to kick against the pricks, isn't it? Of thorns. And Paul said, who are you, Lord, that I persecute you? And he said, I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you persecute. Paul was done. There was no life left in Paul. You see, look how great Paul's calling was. Paul is ready to put his calling up against the calling of Peter at the shore of Galilee any day of the week. Paul is ready to put his calling up against Nathanael's, whom the Lord saw underneath the fig tree, any day of the week. Paul is ready to put his calling by Jesus Christ up against any man's calling. And he said, I did not run up to them. Why? Let's stop and analyze this for a second. Why did Paul not run up to Jerusalem? I would think that that's what he would do. But he didn't. Here's why he didn't. Is because Paul had an existential identity crisis. He did not know what to think. The only thing he knew, that in one moment he thought he was God's greatest defender, and in the next moment he realized he was God's greatest persecutor. And he had to get that sorted out in his mind. Paul said, I didn't go to any man. What I was dealing with, no man could answer. The questions that I had, no man could answer. I could not go to a person who give me their best guess. You see? He said, I went off into Arabia for 3 years. I had to get this figured out. You see? And I returned again unto Damascus. And then he says, then after 3 years, this is the 18th verse. And then after 3 years, I went up again to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him 15 days. But the other apostles saw I none except James, the Lord's brother. So the only apostle he saw was Peter. Now, in Acts, we learn that he went up there and the Lord told him, Paul, they will not receive your message in this city. Now, think about this for a second. Why would they not receive your message in this city? Well, first off, according to the church, he was the greatest persecutor of the church. So the churches, they're not going to receive him. You know, he's just a wolf in sheep's clothing is what the church is going to think. And then let's look at it from the Pharisees' standpoint. To them, they had given Paul a commission. He was supposed to put a stop to this. And they ate meals daily with Paul. And then they turned to find out that Paul's been a traitor all along. he was, all the time, Paul was sitting there saying how horrid these Christians are, and all the time he's just a spy, a no good. Many of these men, Paul knew their children by name. At this time, Paul's about 30 years old, 31 years old. Paul knew their children by name. He knew their wives by name. He had brought bread when he came to visit to many of their homes and handed it to their wives. And these men, the vitriol, the betrayal that they felt, that all the time he was hugging our neck, sitting at our table. He was no more than just a traitor, a spy. You see, that's the way the Jews looked at him. Then the church looked at him almost the same way. So the Lord told Paul, said, Paul, they will not receive your witness in this city. But Paul wanted to tell someone. So he had went up and he figured, I'll tell the apostles my conversion. And he said he stayed with Peter for 2 weeks and didn't see any of the rest of the apostles. Why, we don't know. It could have been that they were off in other parts of the city. We don't know. It's unclear why. He said, but I did see the Lord's brother, which wasn't an apostle, James. And he said, now the things which I write unto you, behold, before God, I am not telling you a lie. Notice what he says here. He says, before God, I am not lying. Now he's going to get into a little bit deeper about his gospel. He says, afterwards, I came into the region of Syria and Cilicia, and was unknown by face unto the churches in Judah, which were in Christ. But they had heard that he which persecuted us in times past now preaches the faith which once he destroyed. You see? Now, it's not like they are... Paul has an overt acceptance of them. But Paul said they glorified God in me, or to better statement, they glorified God because of my conversion. So the man who once persecuted him has now become a Christian. Now, that's not natural. People normally wouldn't have accepted him, but Christians, being trusting, knowing that Jesus Christ can convert any heart, they started to glorify God. But watch what Paul is here. He says that I didn't go and teach the gospel that the church in Jerusalem taught. You see, I know that I don't teach that gospel. I teach another gospel. I teach a further gospel. Now, here's the difference, okay? The apostles, even in Acts 15, they recognized that Paul preached a different message than what Peter, James, and John preached. And the different message, Paul, and here's the thing, is it wasn't like that they were in contradiction one of another. But here's the difference, is Paul believes that they're preaching, the Church of Jerusalem is preaching Christ through the law. And I realized that Christ, though satisfying the requirements of the law, did not come through the law. The promise of Christ and the gospel that we received did not come through the law. It came through a promise. God gave Abraham a promise. Abraham was not a Jew. Abraham was a Gentile. And the Jews received the promise through the law, the promise of God's acceptance through the law. However, the gospel that was promised to Abraham did not come through the law or obedience thereof. It came 430 years before the law came. And the Jews took it as a national identity and an ethnic identity. They took the law, but as an ethnic identity. And though it was an ethnic identity, Paul believes that Christ came apart from the law. And now the church in Jerusalem is preaching Christ through the law. But he believing that Christ came apart from the law because the promise that Christ should come and be the heir of all things and the blessing to the whole world came 430 years before the law was instituted, and it came to a Gentile. So then you see the conflict. Paul believes that not that they're wrong, because God did institute the law through Moses to the Jewish people, but it was because of unbelief that it was entered. But their unbelief did not stop God's original promise 430 years prior, which he gave to Abraham, that he would send Christ through faith and bless all the world. And though a sideline was injected of the law and the Jewish nation as a national identity and an ethnic identity, and coupled with and under the law, but the original message stayed its course, which was the blessing of Christ by faith to all the world. And so then Paul believes that he's going back and attaching the proclamation of Jesus Christ through its original trajectory from Abraham on to this very hour, to where the church in Jerusalem is dropping down 430 years later and bringing the message of Christ through a national identity, through a law that was never intended, and then bringing it back up. I'm bringing it straight through, bypassing the law. There's the difference, and there's the problem. They find fault with me about it. And they believe, not when I say they, I'm talking about the Judaizers, not the apostles. Because Peter acknowledged, when Paul explained it to him, Peter acknowledged in Acts 15 that the Gentiles are now being saved by faith, by which we being the Jews, hope to also be saved in the same manner as the Gentiles are being saved. But once he received the understanding of Paul's message, he proclaimed that. So, but it didn't stop many of the Judaizers in the church of Jerusalem. They continued to try to relegate Christ within the confines of the law. And Paul saying that the message of Christ was never within the confines of the law. It was always above the law. It was outside of the law. It came 430 years before the law. It was outside of the law, and it stayed outside of the law. The Jews are the one, because of their disobedience, dropped down under the law, and God brought them back up to the message of Christ. So they're the ones who had left the original message, the original trajectory, and they did it through the law. And now God is bringing that back up to the original trajectory that it kept on its original path. You see, and so then that's what Paul is trying to say here. And so then he's like, but this message, no one gave it to me. The council in Jerusalem didn't give it to me. The elders in Jerusalem didn't give it to me. Peter didn't give it to me. No one taught it to me. The people that I was thrown into prison, none of them taught it to me. I wasn't going to be dissuaded by any of them from my original course, and that was to persecute the church and to remain within the law. But Jesus Christ come and met me on the road to Damascus, changed my whole identity. I became a new person, and he did it by his grace. I don't know why he didn't call me back when he called the rest of the apostles, but he's sovereign. He does what he wills. But he called me, and then he gave me a message. And that message is a greater understanding than what the apostles and the church in Jerusalem and the Judaizers That it's a higher elevation. This is what Peter meant when Peter said that later on that the writings of Paul, they're hard to understand. And they which are unlearned wrestle with to their own destruction as they do the rest of the scriptures. So let's look here. So what is the crux of our message here? I want to ask for your own application, what is your before and after? Many people have a dramatic testimony of your before and after. Was it as great as Paul's? Never be ashamed by your, or never think that God can't use you because of your before. God called you when it was your time. And when the grace that he had bestowed upon you, the hour of that grace had dawned upon the world, God called you. And then use it to the greatest of your ability, the grace wherewith he has given you. Paul says that he obeyed God's voice and he did not obey man's voice. Why? Because men, they were steadily telling Paul, be quiet, just get in line. Paul couldn't. And also, celebrate others and their particular calling. So the crux of our message here, authority comes from Christ alone. It doesn't come from man. It doesn't come from councils. It doesn't come from denominations. It doesn't come from favor of the multitudes. Authority comes from Christ and Christ alone. Paul said, again, for I neither received it of men, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. To God be the glory. We'll see you in the next service.